series of introductory talks on the Bible. In this talk, Talk 6, I'd like to offer a brief historical background to the biblical story. We must read any literature, and this is especially true of the Bible, through the lens of context. In other words, there is no text without context. So for any piece of writing, there is firstly an internal context. Let's take an example. A word or a phrase from one of the letters of St. Paul that can't be understood or interpreted in isolation. That word or phrase is part of a sentence. The sentence in turn is part of a paragraph. And seeing that Paul's letters are divided into chapters, the paragraph is part of a chapter. The chapter in turn is part of the whole letter. Now, seeing Paul didn't write just one letter, sometimes we might need to consider a particular word or phrase in one letter against the use of that same word or phrase in other of Paul's writings. But Paul's writings are part of the New Testament, and the New Testament in turn is part of the whole Bible. So there's some of the aspects of the internal context of any piece of writing. Then we have an external context, and here we might like to consider things like geography. Where is the story set? In some cases, to understand a particular piece of writing, we need to know something about where it is set. That might be crucial to understanding the meaning of a particular piece of writing. The historical background to a piece of writing could also be crucial in understanding its meaning. What language was it written in? Are we reading it in its original language, or are we reading it in translation? Well, if we're reading the letters of St. Paul in English, we're reading it in translation. How accurate is the translation? What was the cultural milieu at the time Paul was writing? That certainly will have a bearing on how we interpret a particular word or phrase of St. Paul. So geography, history, language and culture are important elements when we consider the external context of any piece of writing. One of the important external elements that we'll need to consider when we're reading the Bible will be the setting of the story. The story is set primarily in the Eastern Mediterranean. The heart of the story takes place in the circled area, what today we know as the modern state of Israel and the Palestinian territories. If we expand our horizon eastwards and look at a contemporary map of the area, we can see the countries of today in which the ancient biblical story is set. Israel, the Palestinian territories, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Greece and Turkey. And of course we must include Rome, which is not seen on this map. This is an area that was also known as the Fertile Crescent, land that was made particularly fertile by the great rivers, the Tigris, the Euphrates and the Nile and their tributaries. But this area was also a vital land bridge between three continents, Europe, Asia and Africa. So we come to the historical context of the biblical story. I'd like to suggest that we divide the story into three periods. Period 1 I'll call the formative period, and that takes us to about 1000 BC. It begins with the story of Abraham and takes us to the second period, the period of the monarchy. The second period takes us to the 6th century before Christ, to what is called the Babylonian exile. And the third period begins with the return home from exile down to the 1st century AD. So let's do a very quick revision. God calls Abraham to leave behind his homeland, to launch out into the unknown, and he settles in Canaan. Jacob and his family, during a time of famine in Canaan, find refuge in Egypt, and the Israelites stay there for some 430 years, until they become a threat to the Egyptians who enslave them. The book of Exodus is the story of liberation from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. The people in the Promised Land are first governed by charismatic rulers called judges, and then by kings, first Saul and then David and Solomon. Under David and Solomon there is a united kingdom. After the death of Solomon there is a schism. Israel and Judah split. Israel in the north, the capital Samaria, Judah in the south, its capital is Jerusalem. In the 8th century the Assyrians wipe out the northern kingdom. In the 6th century the Babylonians attack Judah, and thousands of Jews are taken into exile in Babylon. The Babylonians are conquered by the Persians, and the Persians allow those Jews who wish to return home. But the Persians in turn are defeated by the Macedonians under Alexander the Great. When Alexander dies, his huge empire is divided among his generals, and it doesn't bode well for the Jews who fall under these Seleucids. Antiochus Epiphanes seeks to impose a Hellenistic way of life upon the Jews, and under the Maccabees they revolt and successfully cast off the foreign yoke, and for a brief period of time enjoy freedom in their own land, until in 63 BC Rome invades Palestine. For almost 100 years the Jews are under the yoke of imperial Rome. They rise up in rebellion, and the Romans retaliate brutally. In 70 AD, the temple is destroyed. The formative period begins with the call of Abraham, an event that we situate roughly in 1850 BC. This is the time of the patriarchs. And who are the patriarchs? We're talking about Abraham, his son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons, who become the patriarchal figureheads of the 12 tribes of Israel. During this formative period, the land of Canaan experiences a time of famine, and the patriarchs seek refuge in Egypt, where there's an abundant supply of grain. They settle in Egypt, and they increase and multiply. The Egyptians feel threatened by such a large number of foreigners in their midst, and deal with the threat by enslaving the Israelites. The book of Genesis, commencing at chapter 12, tells us the story of Abraham and the patriarchs, and the book of Exodus tells the story of enslavement and liberation from slavery. Under the leadership firstly of Moses and then of Joshua, the people enter the promised land where they settle. They're led for almost 200 years by charismatic leaders who are called judges. We first meet Abraham in chapter 11 of the book of Genesis, although when we first meet him, he has the name Abram. So Abram is portrayed as a member of a family associated with city life in southern Babylonia. They live in Ur of the Chaldees. Today that would be in southern Iraq. But the family moved to Haran, which is in upper Mesopotamia. And it's while he's in Haran that he receives a call from God. So we read at the beginning of chapter 12 of the book of Genesis, "Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing." So Abraham and his family set out for Canaan, and they settle in Canaan. Abraham is married to Sarah. They have a son, Isaac. Isaac is the father of Jacob, and Jacob has 12 sons who become the patriarchal figureheads of the 12 tribes of Israel. During a time of famine in Canaan, Jacob's clan seeks refuge in Egypt, where there's an abundance of grain. They settle in Egypt, and they remain there, according to the book of Exodus, for 430 years. The book of Genesis ends with the people in Egypt, and the book of Exodus takes up the story with an ominous note. We're told that the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They became so numerous and powerful that eventually the whole land was full of them. But the king of Egypt is alarmed. He says to his people, "The Israelites are now more numerous and stronger than we are. We must take precautions to stop them from increasing any further, or if war should break out, they might join the ranks of our enemies. They might take up arms against us and then escape from the country." And so the people are enslaved. The book of Exodus tells the story of the journey from slavery in Egypt to freedom in the Promised Land. The people are led first by Moses and then by Joshua. The word Exodus, by the way, is a Greek word, ex, out of, and hodos, the way. So the word Exodus means literally the way out. The Exodus probably took place during the reign of Ramses II. He reigned from 1290 to 1235 BC. You can see there a photograph of the mummy of Ramses II. The book of Exodus tells the story of liberation from slavery in Egypt, but it is also the story of a time of testing. The people are tested before they enter the Promised Land. They wander for 40 years in the desert. But one of the key events in the Exodus story is that of Moses receiving the tablets of the law from God on Mount Sinai. The law, or Torah, is to become the heart and the soul of God's revelation to his people. Moses himself dies before the people enter the Promised Land. From Mount Nebo he sees the Promised Land, but he is never to enter it. The mantle of leadership falls to Joshua. In this photograph you can see Pope John Paul II on Mount Nebo, looking out over the Promised Land. The book of Joshua and the book of Judges tell the story of the people entering the Promised Land and the period that follows, the period of Judges, which lasts for about 200 years, from 1200 to 1025 BC. During this time, the people are led by charismatic leaders that we call judges, but that doesn't quite mean judge in our modern sense of the word. The Hebrew word to judge is shaphat, which can be translated as decide, judge, rule, govern, vindicate, or deliver. So the judges are charismatic leaders whom God raises up at moments of crisis in the story of the Jewish people. You might be familiar with one of the famous judges, Samson, and the story of his love for Delilah. And not all of the judges were men. Deborah is included among the list of judges, a woman whom God raises up during a time of conflict and trouble. So during this time we have the rise of the smaller nation-states in Palestine and Syria. And of course the state that we're most interested in is the Kingdom of Israel. So this now takes us to the period of the monarchy. Saul is the first king, followed by David, and then David by his son Solomon. After the death of Solomon, the fragile alliance between the 12 tribes falls apart, and there is a schism, and the kingdom divides into two: Israel in the north, with Samaria as its capital, and Judah in the south, with Jerusalem as its capital. In the 8th century, the northern kingdom is annihilated by Assyria, and in the 6th century, Judah falls to the Babylonians. So let's have a closer look at this period in a bit more detail. In the 10th century before Christ, Saul is anointed as the first king. And after Saul comes David. and under David and his son Solomon, the 12 tribes become a united kingdom. This story is told in the 1st and 2nd books of Samuel, and the 1st and 2nd books of Kings, and the 1st and 2nd books of Chronicles. After the death of Solomon, the kingdom divides. Israel in the north, and the capital of Israel is Samaria, Judah in the south, and the capital of Judah is Jerusalem. The story of the divided kingdom can be found in the 1st and 2nd books of Kings, in the prophet Hosea and the prophet Micah. In the 8th century BC, in 721, the superpower of the region is Assyria, and it wipes out the northern kingdom. Why wasn't Judah also annihilated? Simply because they realized that to stand up to Assyria would be foolish. They instead paid tribute, and they were spared, unlike the northern kingdom that foolishly thought they could resist the might of Assyria. The story is told in the 2nd book of Kings and in the first part of the prophecy of Isaiah. So we now have the Assyrian Empire controlling all of that area that we know as the Fertile Crescent, right down into Egypt. The Assyrians were a very powerful and ruthless people, and to prevent the people they had conquered from rebelling against them, they scattered the conquered populations throughout their empire. The inhabitants were scattered throughout the empire, never to return. The scattered people of Israel are referred to as the 10 lost tribes. What the Assyrians then did was to repopulate conquered lands, in this case Israel, with conquered peoples from other parts of their empire. Now, the capital city of Israel was Samaria, so those who were resettled in Israel, and many of them intermarried with the Israelites who were not deported, they were known as Samaritans, and many of them eventually embraced the Jewish religion. In the course of time, there was a growing tension between the people of Judah and the Samaritans. They never accepted Samaritans as being truly Jewish. So the animosity between Jews and Samaritans is evident in the Gospels. Babylon is the next superpower of the region. It throws off the Assyrian rule in 626 BC and becomes the capital of the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean Empire. So in the 6th century, the Babylonians attack Judah. Jerusalem is destroyed, and thousands of Jews are taken into exile in Babylon. That story is told in the 2nd book of Kings, in the prophet Jeremiah, in the book of Lamentations, in the prophet Baruch, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And how did this happen? Well, Babylon is in modern-day Iraq. The distance between Babylon and Jerusalem is about 800 kilometers, but since it was not possible to travel the distance directly, the exiles would have traveled almost 1,500 kilometers. So in 597 BC, the kingdom of Judah submitted to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar had the king Jehoiakim deported to Babylon. His uncle Zedekiah was placed on the throne and made to swear an oath of fidelity to the Babylonian ruler. But in 588, Judah revolts. Zedekiah reneges, and retaliation was swift and brutal. In 587 and 586, Nebuchadnezzar marches on defiant Jerusalem. He orders the city levelled, and the magnificent Temple of Solomon is razed to the ground, left a pile of rubble. Over 10,000 nobles, artisans, and young men are deported to Babylon. After a march of almost 1,500 kilometers, they reached Babylon. And Psalm 137 recalls the lament of the exiles. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, remembering Zion. On the poplars that grew there we hung up our harps. For it was there that they asked us, our captors for songs, our oppressors for joy. Sing to us, they said, one of Zion's songs. Oh, how could we sing the song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cleave to my mouth, if I remember you not. If I prize not Jerusalem above all my joys. Babylon was a majestic metropolis of 250,000 people. It must have made Jerusalem look like a village. But for all of that, for the Jewish people, it wasn't home. The story of exile is told in Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and the second part of the prophet Isaiah. To those in exile in Babylon, the prophet Ezekiel held out a message of hope with two visions. The first is a vision of a valley of bones. I'm reading from the prophet Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 to 14. The hand of Yahweh was on me. He carried me away by the Spirit of Yahweh and set me down in the middle of the valley, a valley full of bones. He made me walk up and down and all around among them. There were vast quantities of these bones on the floor of the valley, and they were completely dry. He said to me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, You know, Lord Yahweh. He said, Prophesy over these bones. Say, Dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. The Lord Yahweh says this to these bones, I am now going to make breath enter you, and you will live. I shall put sinews on you. I shall make flesh grow on you. I shall cover you with skin and give you breath, and you will live, and you will know that I am Yahweh. I prophesied as I had been ordered. While I was prophesying, there was a noise, a clattering sound. It was the bones coming together, and as I looked, they were covered with sinews. Flesh was growing on them, and skin was covering them, and yet there was no breath in them. He said to me, Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of man, say to the breath, The Lord Yahweh says this, Come from the four winds, breath, breathe on these dead, so that they come to life. I prophesied as he had ordered me, and the breath entered them. They came to life and stood up on their feet, a great and immense army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. They keep saying, Our bones are dry, our hope is gone, we are done for. So prophesy, say to them, The Lord Yahweh says this, I am now going to open your graves. I shall raise you from your graves, my people, and lead you back to the soil of Israel. And you will know that I am Yahweh when I open your graves and raise you from your graves, my people, and put my spirit in you, and you revive, and I resettle you on your own soil. Then you will know that I, Yahweh, have spoken and done this, declares the Lord Yahweh. In chapter 47 of the prophet Ezekiel, we have another vision, this time a vision of the temple, but the temple restored, and once again the source of life. I'm reading from the beginning of chapter 47 of the prophet Ezekiel. He brought me back to the entrance of the temple, where a stream flowed eastwards from under the temple threshold, for the temple faced east. The water flowed from under the right side of the temple, south of the altar. He took me out by the north gate, and led me right round outside as far as the outer east gate, where the water flowed out on the right-hand side. The man went off to the east, holding his measuring line, and measured off 1,000 cubits. He then made me wade across the stream. The water reached my ankles. He measured off another 1,000, and made me wade across the stream again. The water reached my knees. He measured off another 1,000, and made me wade across the stream again. The water reached my waist. He measured off another 1,000. It was now a river which I could not cross. The stream had swollen and was now deep water, a river impossible to cross. He then said, "Do you see, Son of Man?" Then he took me and brought me back to the bank on the river. Now when I reached it, I saw an enormous number of trees on each bank of the river. He said, "This water flows east down to the Arabah and to the sea, and flowing into the sea, it makes its waters wholesome. Wherever the river flows, all living creatures teeming in it will live. Fish will be very plentiful, for wherever the water goes, it brings health, and life teems wherever the river flows." And so it goes on. But what happens next? Well, the promises of the Lord Yahweh come to pass. In the 6th century, the Persians conquer Babylon, and the Jews are allowed to return home. Although they don't have independence, they're now ruled by Persian governors, but they are at last home. The return from exile is the background to the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zechariah. So in 539 BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire falls to Cyrus, the great king of Persia. Cyrus issued a decree permitting captive people, including the Jews, to return to their own land. The temple is rebuilt, and the priest in charge of the temple, the high priest, is given jurisdiction as a local ruler of the people. The Persian king remains the final authority over the land and its people. To the third stage in this overview of the historical backdrop to the biblical story, the time from the post-exilic period to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. To date, we've seen 3 powerful empires dominate Israel and the surrounding region: Assyria in the 8th century, and in the 6th century, both Babylon and Persia. The Persian king Cyrus was the founder of a powerful empire that dominated Western Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean for 2 centuries. He freed the Jews, he paid for their return, and he funded the rebuilding of the temple. Persian rule continued for nearly 2 centuries until the conquests of Alexander the Great, the ruler of Macedon. In the British Museum you can find what is known as the Cyrus cylinder. It was discovered in the 19th century. Written in Babylonian cuneiform, this 6th century cylinder documents Cyrus the Great's conquest of Babylon. So now we come to what is known as the Hellenistic period, the conquest of Alexander the Great. The term Hellenistic age refers to the period between the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC and the conquest of Egypt by Rome in 30 BC. So in the 4th century BC, the Macedonians, under Alexander the Great, conquer Persia. Alexander overthrows the Persian Empire, conquering most of the lands around the eastern Mediterranean as far as modern-day India. The Jews still have no independence. They're governed first by Greeks in Egypt, known as the Ptolemies, and then after 198 BC by the Greeks in Syria, the Seleucids. Here you can see a map outlining the Macedonian Empire. It was, as you can see, extensive. After Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire in the Near East was divided between his generals, the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria. Jerusalem was first under the Ptolemies until 198 BC and then under the Seleucids, who were based in Syria. Disaster befell the Jewish people with the Seleucid ruler Antiochus Epiphanes. He decided to bring greater cultural unity to his empire by requiring his subjects to adopt aspects of Greek civilization. Many Jews found this process of Hellenization, this imposition of Greek culture, absolutely offensive to their religion. In response to protests, Antiochus tightened the screws even further. He made it illegal for Jews to circumcise their baby boys and to maintain their Jewish identity. He converted the Jewish temple into a pagan sanctuary, and he required Jews to sacrifice to the pagan gods. The name Antiochus Epiphanes means Antiochus, the manifestation, the epiphany of God. That word Epiphanes is the word that we translate into English as epiphany, literally a shining forth. So on the coin that you can see there, it has the name Antiochus and then the title given to him, God Manifest, bearer of victory. You could understand how offensive that would be to Jewish sensibilities, that a human being would claim to be the manifestation of God. And so that led to a revolt led by the Maccabees. The revolt breaks out, started by a family of Jewish priests known to history both as the Maccabeans, that name based on the name given to one of its powerful leaders, Judas Maccabeus, the Hammerer, and also as the Hasmoneans, based on the name of a distant ancestor. That story is told in the first and second books of Maccabees. The Maccabean revolt began as a small guerrilla skirmish and ended with much of the country in armed rebellion against its Syrian overlords. It started in 167 BC, and in less than 25 years, the Maccabeans had successfully driven the Syrian army out of the land and assumed full and total control of its governance. They created the first sovereign Jewish state for over 4 centuries. Again, the story is in the first and second books of Maccabees. They rededicated the temple in 164 BC, an event that is still celebrated right down to the present day. It's known as the Feast of Hanukkah. And the Hasmoneans appointed a high priest as supreme ruler of the land. The Hasmoneans ruled the land as an autonomous state for some 80 years, until 63 BC, when the Roman general Pompey comes in conquest. So the Maccabees established the Hasmonean dynasty, which ruled from 164 BC until 63 BC. It came to an end in 63 BC when Rome invaded Palestine, led by the Roman general Pompey. And here you can see the extent of the Roman Empire. Initially, the Romans allowed the high priest to remain in office, using him as an administrative liaison with the local Jewish leadership. But in 40 BC, Rome appointed a king to rule the Jews of Palestine. We know this king by the name of Herod the Great. During the life of Jesus, after Herod's death, Galilee, the northern region where Jesus lived, was ruled by Herod's son Antipas. He was known literally as a tetrarch. He was the ruler of a quarter of his father's kingdom. But starting when Jesus was a boy, Judea, the southern region, was governed by Roman administrators known as prefects. Pontius Pilate was prefect during the whole of Jesus' ministry and for some years after his death. So Pontius Pilate is the best known of the Roman prefects. He controlled the province of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. Not only do we know of him through the Gospels, but he's mentioned on what's called the Pilate stone. It's the name given to a block of limestone with a carved inscription attributed to Pontius Pilate. It's dedicated to the emperor, but it says that Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this. As you can see from the photograph, the Pilate stone is not in good condition. Pilate, as the prefect, didn't live in Jerusalem. He lived in Caesarea. Not Caesarea Philippi that we read of in the Gospels, but Caesarea Maritima. That city was built by Herod the Great about 25 to 13 BC. You can see there a photograph from the air of Caesarea Maritima, or at least the ruins of Caesarea Maritima. It's now a national park on the Israeli coastline. And this picture gives you an idea of what it would have looked like at the time of Jesus. King Herod was renowned for his magnificent building projects, which included the rebuilding of the Second Temple. You may recall that Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. When the people returned from exile, they eventually began the task of rebuilding their temple. The rebuilding was completed on March the 3rd, 515 BC. The Persian king Cyrus allowed the surviving temple treasures looted by the Babylonians to be returned to Jerusalem. Although this temple stood for almost 500 years, it's rather surprising that there is so little descriptive material in the literary record. The rebuilt temple would have borne some of the splendour of Solomon's temple, but the older Jews, who could still remember Solomon's temple, and there'd be very few of them still living, but they regarded the rebuilt temple as a poor substitute. The pictures that you can see now are not of the Second Temple, but of Herod's renovated temple. In fact, Herod's temple was not technically a renovation, it was an entirely new structure, and it constituted, in effect, a third temple, although it's always designated as the Second Temple. Well, let's have a closer look at Herod's temple. Here you can see what's known as Robinson's Arch. That's the name given to a monumental staircase which once stood at the southwestern corner of the Temple Mount. The arch is named after the biblical scholar Edward Robinson, who identified its remnants in 1838. All that you can see of Robinson's Arch today is this piece of masonry jutting out of the wall. But this animation gives you an idea of what it once would have looked like. This monumental staircase taking you up to the Temple Mount. Be reasonably certain that Jesus himself would have walked up these stairs. And they take you to what is called the Royal Portico, or the Royal Colonnade. It was a centre of public and commercial activity, and it was the likely scene for the cleansing of the temple recorded in the Gospels. Its architectural style is that of a Roman basilica. So looking towards the temple, across the court of the Gentiles, this is what we would see. Gentiles, that is non-Jews, could walk through the court of the Gentiles, but they could proceed no further. In fact, an inscription barring non-Jews from the sanctified area of the temple was discovered by archaeologists in Jerusalem in 1871. It reads, "No stranger is to enter within the balustrade around the temple and enclosure. Whoever is caught will be responsible to himself for his death, which will ensue." Jesus grew up in Nazareth, in the Galilee region. He was known as Jesus of Nazareth. From Jerusalem to Nazareth, by road, it's a distance of about 147 kilometres. Now, Nazareth is not mentioned once in the whole of the Old Testament, nor is it mentioned by the Jewish historian Josephus, who mentions a number of villages and towns in the Galilee region, but not once does he mention Nazareth. It's not mentioned in the Talmud. The population of Nazareth at the time of Jesus would have been about 480 people. Now what that means is that nobody of any importance from the Jewish point of view ever lived there. Nothing of any significance ever happened there. In Nazareth, Jesus was, well, the Gospels call him a tekton. We translate that word as carpenter, but it could equally be a handyman, anyone who works with timber, with metal, or with stone. Modern-day Nazareth has a population of over 80,000 people. It's dominated by the massive Basilica of the Annunciation, which is visible from almost anywhere in the town. The present building was dedicated in 1968, but it was built over the ruins of Byzantine and Crusader churches. According to an early Christian tradition, the church is built on the site of the house where Mary lived. In the 4th century AD, in 384 AD, the pilgrim Egeria, we've met her before. She was possibly a nun, either from Spain or Gaul. When she went to Nazareth, she was shown a big and splendid cave in which Mary had lived. And that takes us to the crypt of the present basilica. And you can see there what remains of the cave, which tradition tells us was part of the home of Mary. On the altar there you find the words verbum caro hic factum est. Here the word of God became flesh. When he began his public ministry, Jesus moved from Nazareth and lived in Capernaum. Capernaum is a village on the shore of the Lake of Galilee, a distance of about 40 kilometres from Nazareth, today a drive of about 1.5 hours. You can see there what Capernaum might have looked like at the time of Jesus, a village of about 1,500 people. And here you can see all that remains of Capernaum today as viewed from the Sea of Galilee. By the way, we call it the Sea of Galilee, but in reality it's just a very large freshwater lake. It is certainly not a sea. And that's quite possibly what Capernaum looked like from the lake at the time of Jesus. The large building in the background is the synagogue. And in this photograph you can see the remains of the synagogue today. In fact, that is not the synagogue that stood there at the time of Jesus. But archaeologists tell us that that synagogue was built on the foundations of the older synagogue that was there at the time of Jesus. In the foreground, you can see the remains of the village of Capernaum. Whenever I go to the Holy Land, I always enjoy coming to this synagogue. This is the scene of chapter 6 of St. John's Gospel, the long discourse on the bread of life. This is the scene where Jesus, in Mark's Gospel, begins his public ministry by casting out an unclean spirit from a young boy. So this synagogue dates from the late 4th or early 5th century, but it was built on the foundations of the synagogue that Jesus knew. Close by the synagogue is a rather large church. It's a strange shape. In fact, it always reminds me of a flying saucer. But it's raised up, and the purpose of it being raised up is to enable us to see the remains beneath it, the remains of the house of Simon Peter. Egeria, our 4th century pilgrim, when she visited Capernaum, she wrote, "The house of the Prince of the Apostles has been made into a church with its original walls still standing." And 2 centuries later, the Piacenza pilgrim writes, "The house of St. Peter is now a basilica." You can see there the site from the air. On the left, you have the church built over the house of Simon Peter. To the right, the remains of the synagogue. Again, in the foreground here, the remains of the village of Capernaum, a village that Jesus knew intimately. So the Holy Land has often been called the fifth gospel. We have Jerusalem to the south. Jesus lived in Capernaum, as we've just seen, by the shore of the Lake of Galilee. The Dead Sea is to the south, and joining the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea is the River Jordan. The story of Mark's Gospel is the story of a journey. Mark uses the motif of a journey as a kind of coat hanger from which to hang his narrative. It's a journey from Galilee in the north to Jerusalem in the south. And the Gospels of Matthew and Luke take up that motif of a journey from Mark. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed by the Romans. The Jews had risen up in rebellion, and the Romans retaliated brutally. The temple was destroyed. Jerusalem fell. If you visit Rome, you can go to the Arch of Titus. It was built to commemorate Titus's victory over the Jews. And you'll see there a frieze which shows the Roman soldiers taking booty from the temple. In particular, in this frieze you can see the menorah, the 7-branched candlestick that came from the Jewish temple. So there you see the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. Christianity began there as a small, persecuted sect. It was very soon to become the main religion of the Roman Empire. And one of the people responsible for that was the Apostle St. Paul. This map shows his 3 missionary journeys and his final journey to Rome. It was in Rome that both Paul and Peter were martyred for the faith.